Jonathan Rumi stepped into the community center in Chicago, where warm golden lights spilled across the worn wooden floors. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the corner of the room, where kids chased each other during a charity event he'd helped organize. As an actor known for playing Jesus in The Chosen, Jonathan often visited places like this, not just to spread joy, but to listen to the stories that came straight from the heart. Tonight he expected a simple evening, signing a few photos, chatting with the kids, and heading home. But fate had other plans. Mr. Jonathan, a small voice called, cutting through his thoughts. He turned slightly startled. Standing before him was a girl maybe 8 years old with neatly braided brown hair and eyes so wide they seemed to hold the entire night sky. She wore a green sweater and clutched a small book tightly. "I have a question for you," she said, her voice soft but serious. Jonathan smiled, assuming it would be something light maybe. "Is acting fun, or what's it like to play Jesus?" He knelt down to meet her gaze, his tone warm. "Go ahead, ask me anything." But the girl looked straight into his eyes, unflinching, and asked, "What do you think happens when we die?" The question hit him like a sudden gust of wind. Jonathan blinked, trying to mask his surprise. This wasn't what he'd expected from a child. He'd fielded tough questions before, from fans, interviewers, even skeptics about faith, his role, or the meaning behind The Chosen. But a little girl asking about death, it made his heart pause. He studied her innocent face, wondering why such a young soul carried such a heavy question. "What's your name?" he asked, buying a moment to gather his thoughts. "Sophie," she replied, her voice steady. "I want to know, when we die, what happens?" Jonathan took a deep breath. As a devout Catholic, faith had guided him through his darkest days, from scraping by in the entertainment industry to nearly going broke years ago. But this question wasn't just about faith. It touched mysteries that even he, the man who'd portrayed Jesus, wasn't sure he fully grasped. The community center seemed to grow quieter, as if the room itself was holding its breath for his answer. "That's a big question, Sophie," he said slowly, his voice gentle and warm. "I don't have all the answers, but I'll share what I think, okay?" He paused, searching for the right words. Sophie nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation, as if she expected something magical. Jonathan glanced around, noticing curious looks from volunteers and parents nearby. He turned back to Sophie, feeling the weight of her questions settle on his shoulders. "I believe this life, this world, is a beautiful gift," he began. "We have stars, mountains, people who love us. And I think even if we don't know exactly what happens after we die, all this beauty, it's part of something bigger." Sophie tilted her head, her brows furrowing slightly. "You mean when we die, we become part of the stars?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The question caught Jonathan off guard. He hadn't thought of it that way. As an actor, he was used to stepping into roles, but standing before Sophie, he felt like just another person grappling with a riddle too vast for simple answers. He scratched his chin, a faint pressure building in his chest. "I'm not sure, Sophie," he admitted, his tone honest. "Maybe we don't need to know everything right now. Maybe asking questions, searching for answers, is already something special." He offered a small smile, hoping his words would bring her some comfort. But Sophie wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But what if there's a God?" she asked softly. "What if God is real?" The question sent a shiver through Jonathan. His heart skipped a beat. He'd played Jesus, prayed daily, spoken about faith to millions, but this direct challenge from a child forced him to confront his own beliefs in a new way. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "Sophie, that's a question even grown-ups wrestle with," he said, his voice calm but earnest. "I believe there's something greater than us, a love, a light that guides us. But everyone feels it differently. Some find it in God, some in science, some in both. The important thing is to keep your heart open, okay?" Sophie stared at him, her eyes glistening as if tears were forming. "But what if God isn't real?" she asked, her voice trembling, as if she feared her own words. Jonathan's chest tightened. He saw it now. Sophie wasn't just curious. She was carrying a fear, a quiet unease that even adults struggled to face. He knelt closer, meeting her gaze with warmth. "Sophie," he said, his voice firm yet kind, "I can't answer everything for you, but I know this: asking these questions, wanting to understand, it's brave. And I believe no matter what you find, you'll never be alone. Suddenly, Sophie's tears spilled over. They rolled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from a deep emotion she couldn't name. Jonathan froze, unaccustomed to seeing a child cry after a talk like this. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "It's okay, Sophie. Sometimes crying helps us let things go." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, nodding, though her gaze remained distant, lost in thought. Jonathan stood, a strange peace settling over him. This brief exchange had touched something profound within him, a part he hadn't explored in years. He looked at Sophie once more, still seated, clutching her book, her mind clearly spinning. As he walked away from the room, the community center's noise flooded back, kids, laughing, volunteers chatting, but Jonathan felt like he was in another world. Sophie's questions echoed in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. Had he said enough? Had he offered her hope, or had he missed something vital? The questions lingered, pulling him into a deeper search he hadn't anticipated. Jonathan Rumi walked out into the chilly Chicago night, the glow of the community center fading behind him. The city's hum car horns, distant sirens, felt distant compared to the weight of Sophie's questions. He pulled his coat tighter, his breath visible in the crisp air. As an actor who'd portrayed Jesus, he was used to talking about faith, but this was different. Sophie's words, "What happens when we die and what if God isn't real?" had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't faced in years. He climbed into his car, the engine's soft rumble filling the silence. Driving through the city, he couldn't shake the image of Sophie's tear-streaked face. Her questions weren't just curious. They were raw, vulnerable, like she was searching for a lifeline. Jonathan had spent years studying scripture, praying and sharing his faith, but those questions made him feel exposed, as if he were standing on a stage without a script. Had he given her enough? Had he said too much? Back at his hotel, Jonathan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the city skyline through the window. The lights twinkled like stars, reminding him of Sophie's question about becoming part of them after death. He chuckled softly, amazed at how a child could frame something so profound in such a simple way. But the chuckle faded as he realized he hadn't fully answered her. He'd leaned on his faith, his belief in a loving God. But what about the uncertainty? What about the fear in her eyes? He opened his laptop, scrolling through emails and notifications, but his mind wasn't there. Instead, he found himself typing into a search bar, "What happens after we die?" The results were a mix of religious texts, scientific articles, and philosophical essays. He clicked on a few, skimming through explanations of heaven, reincarnation, and even theories about consciousness dissolving into the universe. None of it felt complete. None of it felt like the answer Sophie deserved. Jonathan closed the laptop and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He thought about his own journey, how he'd grown up in a mixed-faith household with an Orthodox father and a Catholic mother, how he'd drifted through his 20s before finding his way back to God. His role in The Chosen had deepened his faith, but it also made him a target for questions he didn't always feel equipped to answer. Playing Jesus didn't mean he had all the solutions. It meant he had to wrestle with the mysteries just like everyone else. The next morning, Jonathan attended a breakfast meeting with the organizers of the community center event. They praised his presence, saying the kids had been thrilled to meet him, but as they talked, he found himself distracted, replaying Sophie's questions. One of the organizers, a woman named Clara, noticed his quiet demeanor. "You okay, Jonathan?" She asked, her voice kind but curious. He hesitated, then decided to share. "One of the kids last night, Sophie, she asked me about death, about God. It's been on my mind ever since." Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "Kids have a way of cutting through the noise, don't they?" "What did you tell her?" Jonathan recounted the conversation, his voice steady but laced with doubt. "I told her it's okay to ask questions, to keep searching. But I don't know if that was enough. She seemed scared." Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped. "You gave her honesty. That's more than most people get. Sometimes it's not about having the answer. It's about showing them they're not alone in wondering." Her words lingered as Jonathan left the meeting. He walked through Chicago's bustling streets, passing families, street performers, and vendors. The city felt alive, vibrant, yet Sophie's questions made him see it differently. Every person he passed was carrying their own mysteries, their own fears about what lay beyond. He wondered if he'd been too focused on his career, his faith, to notice the quiet struggles around him. That evening, Jonathan attended a small church service near his hotel, hoping for clarity. The priest spoke about trust in God, trust in the unknown. As Jonathan listened, he felt a pull to pray not for answers but for guidance. He closed his eyes, picturing Sophie's face, and whispered a prayer for her peace. But even as he prayed, a new question formed. Could faith and doubt coexist? Could he, a man who portrayed Jesus, admit that he didn't have all the pieces? The service ended, and Jonathan lingered in the pew, staring at the flickering candles. He thought about his role in The Chosen, how it had forced him to confront his own humanity. Playing Jesus wasn't just about reciting lines. It was about embodying love, compassion, and even uncertainty. Maybe that was the key, not to solve Sophie's questions, but to walk with her through them. As he stepped back into the night, Jonathan felt a shift. Sophie's questions weren't a burden, they were a gift. They'd forced him to look beyond the surface of his faith, to dig deeper. He didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time he felt okay with that. The search itself was enough, at least for now. Jonathan returned to his routine in the weeks that followed, but Sophie's questions clung to him like a shadow. Filming for The Chosen kept him busy with long days on set and late nights memorizing lines. Yet in the quiet moments between takes in his trailer or during his drives home, his mind wandered back to that Chicago community center. He saw Sophie's wide eyes, heard her trembling voice. Her questions had opened a door he couldn't close, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. He began reading more, not just scripture, but books on philosophy, theology, and even science. He dove into C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, Thomas Merton's meditations and articles on near-death experiences. Each page offered a piece of the puzzle, but none completed it. He found himself texting friends, fellow actors, priests, even a scientist he'd met at a conference, asking their thoughts on life after death. Their answers varied. Some spoke of heaven with certainty, others of energy returning to the universe, and a few admitted they didn't know. The diversity of perspectives fascinated him, but it also left him restless. One afternoon, while on a break from filming, Jonathan sat with his co-star Elizabeth, who played Mary Magdalene. They often talked about faith, and he trusted her insight. "A kid asked me about death a while back," he said, stirring his coffee. "It's been messing with me. She wanted to know what happens if God's real." I didn't know what to say. Elizabeth tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Kids see through the fluff. They want the truth, even if it's messy." "What did you tell her?" Jonathan recounted the conversation, his voice tinged with frustration. "I said it's okay to question, to search, but I keep wondering if I dodge the hard stuff. What if she needed more?" Elizabeth smiled gently. "You gave her permission to wonder. That's huge. Faith isn't about having it all figured out. It's about trusting the journey even when it's scary." Her words echoed Clara's from Chicago, and Jonathan felt a spark of clarity. Maybe the point wasn't to solve the mystery, but to embrace it. Still, he couldn't shake the urge to dig deeper. He started journaling, scribbling thoughts about God, death, and the universe. One entry read, "What if faith is the courage to ask questions even when the answers don't come? What if Sophie's fear is the same as mine?" His search took him to unexpected places. He attended a lecture by a physicist who spoke about consciousness and the cosmos, blending science with spirituality. The speaker argued that the universe itself might be a kind of intelligence, a thought that intrigued Jonathan. He jotted down notes, wondering if this could bridge Sophie's questions about stars and God. But as he left the lecture, he felt the same familiar ache. Knowledge wasn't enough. Sophie hadn't been asking for theories. She'd been asking for hope. One night, unable to sleep, Jonathan stepped onto his balcony, the Los Angeles skyline sprawling before him. The stars were faint, drowned out by city lights, but they reminded him of Sophie's question about becoming part of them. He closed his eyes, letting the cool air wash over him. For the first time, he didn't pray for answers. Instead, he prayed for peace for himself, for Sophie, for everyone grappling with the unknown. The prayer felt like a release, as if he were letting go of the need to control the outcome. The next day, Jonathan received an invitation to a dinner in Chicago, hosted by a local charity. The organizer mentioned it would be a gathering of thinkers, artists, scientists, and spiritual leaders discussing the human experience. He hesitated, knowing his schedule was tight, but something tugged at him. Chicago, the city where he'd met Sophie. It felt like a sign. At the dinner, the conversation flowed from art to ethics to the nature of existence. Jonathan listened, his mind racing. A scientist argued that death was simply the end of consciousness, while a poet countered that love transcended physical boundaries. Then an elderly woman across the table, Evelyn, with kind eyes and a quiet presence, spoke up. "Jonathan," she said, her voice steady, "you've portrayed Jesus, touched millions with your work. What do you believe when you look at the stars?" The question caught him off guard, echoing Sophie's. He paused, feeling the weight of every eye on him. I think, he began, choosing his words carefully. The universe is full of mysteries we can't fully grasp. Maybe that's the point. The not knowing, it's what keeps us searching, keeps us connected. Evelyn nodded, her smile warm. The search is the sacred part, she said softly. It's where we find each other. Her words stayed with him as he left the dinner, a new sense of purpose stirring. He realized Sophie's questions weren't just hers, they were universal. And maybe his role as an actor and a man of faith wasn't to provide answers, but to guide others through the wondering. Months passed, and Jonathan's life remained a whirlwind of filming interviews and speaking engagements. Yet Sophie's questions continued to shape his perspective. He found himself more open in conversations, more willing to admit his doubts. Fans would approach him asking about The Chosen or his faith, and he'd share stories of his own search, often mentioning the little girl in Chicago who'd changed him. Her questions had become a lens through which he saw the world. One spring day, Jonathan received an email from the Chicago Community Center. They were hosting another event for kids, and they hoped he'd return. His heart skipped a beat. Chicago. Sophie. He hadn't seen her since that night, but he'd never forgotten her. He cleared his schedule, booking a flight without hesitation. As the plane descended over Lake Michigan, he wondered if she'd be there, if she'd remember him. At the community center, the familiar warmth greeted him. Kids running around, volunteers setting up tables, music playing softly. Jonathan scanned the room, his eyes searching for Sophie. He didn't see her at first, and a pang of disappointment hit him. Maybe she'd moved on, or maybe her family no longer came to these events. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the kids who approached him, eager for hugs and autographs. Then, as he was signing a poster, he heard a familiar voice. Mr. Jonathan. He turned, and there she was, Sophie, a little taller now, her hair still neatly braided. Her eyes sparkled with recognition, and a wide smile spread across her face. "You came back," she said, her voice bright with excitement. Jonathan crouched down, his heart full. "I couldn't stay away," he said, grinning. "I've been thinking about you, Sophie, about our talk." Her smile softened, and she clutched a new book in her hands, a journal, he noticed. "I've been thinking about it too," she said. "I've been writing down my questions, about God, about everything." He felt a surge of pride. "That's amazing, Sophie. What kind of questions?" She opened her journal, showing him pages filled with neat handwriting. Like, why do we love people? Where do dreams come from? And if God's there, why do bad things happen? Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the same searching look from their first meeting. Jonathan listened, struck by her curiosity. "Those are big questions," he said. "You know, I've been asking some of my own since we talked, and I've learned something." Sophie leaned closer, eager. What she asked. "I've learned that the answers aren't always what matter," he said. "It's the asking, the wondering that keeps us alive. It's what makes us human." Sophie nodded, her face thoughtful. "So it's okay if I don't figure it all out?" she asked, her voice soft. "More than okay," Jonathan said. "It's beautiful." He paused, then added, "Keep writing, Sophie. Keep asking. You're not alone in this." She smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time, Jonathan felt like he'd given her something real, not an answer, but a companion in the journey. As the event continued, Jonathan stayed by Sophie's side, listening as she shared more of her thoughts. He realized that their conversation wasn't just about her questions, it was about connection. She'd reminded him that faith wasn't a destination, but a path, one they were walking together. The Chicago event marked a turning point for Jonathan. Sophie's presence, her journal full of questions, had grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. He returned to his life with a renewed sense of purpose, not just as an actor, but as a seeker. He began incorporating his experiences into his work, speaking more openly about doubt, wonder, and the beauty of not knowing. At fan events, he shared Sophie's story without using her name, describing how a child's curiosity had reshaped his faith. He stayed in touch with the Chicago Community Center, sending books for their library and checking in on Sophie's progress. Her mother sent him updates saying Sophie had started a question club at school where kids shared their big ideas about life. Jonathan smiled at the thought, imagining Sophie leading discussions with the same intensity she'd shown that first night. His own search continued, though it felt less urgent now. He read, prayed, and talked with others, but he no longer chased certainty. Instead, he embraced the mystery, finding joy in the questions themselves. One evening, while filming a scene for The Chosen, he stood on a set designed to look like Galilee, the stars bright overhead. As the cameras rolled, he felt a connection not just to the role, but to Sophie, to Evelyn, to everyone who'd ever wondered about the universe. Years later, Jonathan received a letter from Sophie, now a teenager. She'd included a poem she'd written titled The Stars We Seek. It spoke of love loss and the courage to ask questions without answers. At the bottom, she'd written, "Thank you for telling me it's okay to wonder." Jonathan framed the poem, hanging it in his office as a reminder of the little girl who'd changed him. As he grew older, Jonathan's career flourished, but it was the quiet moments, staring at the stars, praying in a church, or talking with a stranger about life, that meant the most. He realized that Sophie's questions had been a gift not just to him, but to everyone they touched. They'd reminded him that faith and curiosity weren't opposites. They were partners weaving a thread of wonder through every life. One night, standing on his balcony, Jonathan looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, but they were there, steady and eternal. He thought of Sophie, of Evelyn, of the countless others he'd met along the way. And in that moment, he understood the search for meaning wasn't about finding the end. It was about the connections forged, the questions asked, and the courage to keep looking no matter where the journey led.